Casual Magic has been sponsored by Quiver, maker of the Quiver and Bolt deck cases and other fine deck holding accessories. Use the code CASUAL on their website for 10% off your order. We're also sponsored by Architect, the premier site for hosting your decks on the internet. I love them and they love me, and it seems like a good reason for you to use them. You can also support Casual Magic directly by going to our Patreon at patreon.com/ShivamB. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Casual Magic, the show where we talk about the fun side of Magic the Gathering. My name is Shivam Bhatt, and Casual Magic is brought to you by Architect and Quiver and my patrons at patreon.com/ShivamB. And yeah, I don't know. Happy New Year to everybody. It's weird because this is not going to come out till March or something, and I've recorded a billion episodes before then, but this is the first one I'm recording post New Year, maybe? I don't even know. I just record a lot. But today I am very, very excited because there's a dude who I've been reading for a long, long time who is joining me today, Cameron Kunzelman, who's a once upon a time was a games journalist and writer at places like Polygon and other places you would have heard of, who has also been on the Magic the Gathering beat for quite a long time, and also is writing a book about Magic, which there have been like a handful historically, but whenever somebody takes an interest in my niche of the hobby academically, I'm always super stoked to hear about it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is really cool because every time, because Magic has never been one of the big mainstream beats for like a lot of the video game websites. I mean, IGN has started to a little bit more now, but I've noticed every time it shows up in like the mainstream of games, your name is attached to it, or has been usually. And so I've always enjoyed reading your articles because it's nice to see people outside of our little bubble talking about Magic, even though if you're talking about Magic, you're also inside the bubble. So let's be real.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm in the bubble, I think. I hope I'm in the bubble.
How long have you been playing?
Since Time Spiral. Time Spiral was my first set. So what year was that? Let me do a little
2005,
7 maybe, or 5, 6. It looks like. Yeah. So
wow, was it really?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was in Japan. Yeah, it must have been after I came back from Japan. That's crazy to think about.
Yeah,
I was definitely working at PlayStation at the time. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just lost in, because there's that bubble of time where I stopped playing between the end. I had stopped playing in Mirage and I came back in Innistrad, but I paid attention for a lot of it because Daily MTG was the only website that was updating for many, many years daily. And I'm I am in college and I read every day. I need something to read. But I think it was 8th edition and Mirrodin is when I kind of stopped paying attention because I became a professional game journalist and moved to Japan. And I was in Japan when Kamigawa was out, which makes me think that I should have been playing Magic in Japan, but I didn't speak enough Japanese or Magic Japanese to get away with it. Right. But yeah, that's awesome. And why? Because I know you're an academic. What is your focus in academia?
My PhD is in communication studies, or actually it's just in communication. And that, that you tell people that, and that can mean a lot of different things. For me, it's about culture and interpretation for the most part, and how do people interact with each other using artifacts, right? The stuff of the world around us. And so I've done a lot of different stuff. I wrote a book a few years ago called The World is Born from Zero. It's about science fiction games and speculation, how do video games allow us to speculate. I did that, in academia and kind of in other places too, but really in academia, part of what happens is when you write a book, you've now proven that you can write a book. You can do that once you have demonstrated I can go through this whole process, which is, in some ways, really intellectually fun, but in other ways, absolute pure torture, right? You got to write the thing. It goes through all these different forms of review. It's very rigorous, which, you can have different feelings on. And then it takes forever. That's really the struggling part, right? The benefit of writing on the internet is that it all goes pretty quick, right? And if you can you enjoy that pace, then you can do a lot. When I was working for Waypoint as a columnist for a couple years, that was great. I wrote a column a week, and I wrote more than that too, but at least that. And it was like you come up with an idea, you work on the idea, you work with editors to make it feel good, and then you go from there. But an academic book, you write it kind of in this weird solitude, and then you hope people like it, and then you get feedback, and then it eventually is done. But once I wrote the one book, available for, I think it's $21 on your platform of choice in paperback. People can check that out. But once I did that, then it was like, what's the next project? And I kind of signed on to two simultaneously, which is an uncommon thing. But
that seems like a bad idea, generally speaking.
It was the pandemic. It was like, right. As we're still in it. Right. But it was, I was in my house a lot. Right. And I thought, I did it once. So how hard could it be to do it twice in a row? Turns out it's actually very hard. But so, yeah, I've just finished up a book on Assassin's Creed, the video game franchise. Yeah, which I've also written a lot about over the years. I've covered a lot of those games in all kinds of different ways. And so I wrote this kind of big franchise spanning book, which is just to say, like, Assassin's Creed as 20 plus games over 15ish years, some of which are mainline and treated as maybe more serious than others. There's all this weird stuff going on with it. What I was really curious about, in movies and in media studies and in cinema studies and just, in the culture that we live in broadly, we're very comfortable saying things like, well, Michael Bay's Transformers movies do blah, 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 blah. Or, the Star Wars franchise is blah, blah, blah. But in video games, and especially video games academic stuff, we're a lot more hesitant to talk about big stuff, I think. Which doesn't mean people don't do it. It's just less common. It's much more common for someone to write a book or have an idea or write an essay about a very narrow part of one specific thing.
Yeah, because I've noticed one thing, like, this has been an interest of mine since I was a games journalist, even because when I was just starting, the idea of new games journalism, of applying academic rigor and actual life experience to video game reviews and stuff, was a movement that was just beginning to really take form. And because I know, when I was at OneUp, a lot of the folks who I was writing with, like Jeremy Parrish and other people like that, were really pushing this narrative and this idea that are who we are, and not just this game's got pretty graphics and we can jump 3 times and it's got 14 levels. No, but as opposed to what does it really mean to play a game? How does this resonate with us? My mentor Jane, God, I forget what her last name is, but she was one of the ones who just taught me how to she wrote about the Res Trans vibrator when it came out many billion years ago, and about just the really evocative nature of how these things are. And I've noticed in the past 15 or so years since then that a lot of people have really taken that and run with it, which is just we're only just now getting to the point where we can actually study these games and these hobbies with an academic rigor, or even with life experience. When you see Ristic Studies Sam and the kinds of artistry that he's applying to Magic cards, which is just what, really? It's amazing to me. And I think we've finally matured as an audience that we can accept these things, and also we're old enough that we can write them ourselves.
Right. I mean, and I think that's a big part of it. So, these big scalar kind of things, I was just curious, what does it feel like to do it for games? So I wrote the Assassin's Creed book. It's in and it's locked. It's coming out in September.
You must have been excited when Assassin's Creed and Magic came out with the crossover.
The book was locked after that happened, thankfully. So I didn't have to, I was not responsible for having to talk about that, even though I am working on one of the shelves behind me. I'm working on my full set of the Assassin's Creed set, just for for collector fun. But yeah, while I was working on that book, I was there were these conversations happening about someone doing kind of a big Magic book, because there's really hasn't been a big academic Magic book. There's a really good edited volume that's out that Shelley Jones edited that I think people would probably be interested in. It's got some really good stuff in it, but there's no kind of single author. Here's a big analysis academic book.
We've had a couple of like histories of Magic come out. We've had obviously a couple of these like books on like Gush and whatever, but and like a couple of books on Commander even. But those are less like an academically rigorous study of Magic and more just like, here's how to do things. And that's fine. That's good. Those books should exist and they're great. But I was just really interested because again, one of the reasons like I've enjoyed reading your writing for so many years, especially over at Waypoint, and like, is because like you have this, I guess it's like the descendant of the new game journalism kind of style of like, you know how to inhabit these games and talk about them in a way that contextualizes them within the world, as opposed to just, here's the new cards that are coming out in the new set. And it's just, and so I'm interested to see what a book length narrative of Magic would be like. How are you approaching this topic? Because Magic, 35 years, 32 years, I don't even know, some billion years now. And it's 31 years or so. And it's gotten a million cards, hundreds of millions of players around the world. What does, like, how do you even begin to holistically approach this topic?
I ended up writing the proposal essentially 3 separate times. I was approached one time by one group who were interested in publishing a book on Magic, and they were great, they were awesome, but their expectations about what that would look like and what mine were different, right? So we ended up not doing that. So I just had this proposal laying around. And then ultimately ended up connecting with the MIT press. So it's going to come from MIT. And I kind of figured out in that process of writing the proposal and rewriting the proposal what it would look like. So the way that I'm doing it is essentially I kind of arbitrarily sliced Magic into a bunch of different pieces. Because, like you're saying, it's so big. And it's also really difficult because it's an old game, right? It's really difficult to kind of trans-historically talk about the whole thing, right? Magic in 1997 is not Magic today, right? They are very different things. It's just something we happen to call Magic, right? It's got some DNA together, but they are not really recognizable to one another in terms of like putting them together.
I'm going to make an analogy here that you might appreciate, but Magic reminds me, when you look at it holistically, a lot like the evolution of Hinduism, which is to say, when you look at ancient Hinduism, the Vedic religion that people like we study in high school, or whatever, it's like, it's got these Vedas and these, classes and stuff, and these gods that are mentioned. And then you look at Hinduism as practiced on the ground today, 2,000, 3,000 years later after that. None of those deities or rituals or things that are in the Vedas that we call the baseline of Hinduism matter, or like nobody is going out sacrificing horses and having their horse run around the area and saying, this is now my land, or moving their altar 5 inches to the east or whatever it is, right? Like, but there's a continuity that kind of gives you, like, if you look at a snapshot of any given time next to each other, they won't actually feel like they're part of the same unit at all. However, in the spectrum, you've got this kind of like, oh, I can see where this comes from. Yeah.
And so that's a big part of it, is like cutting it into those different pieces and kind of tracking over time how they've changed and maybe what the meaning behind those changes is.
I like the idea of your name being cumulative upkeep.
That's the tentative title. I don't know if that will end up being the final title, that it's got to go through, marketing will have their way with it, I think, at some point and decide what some things are. But that is the pitch, is cumulative upkeep, because I think that, as you're just saying, right, I think that's the big part of it, right, is that the thing that is interesting to me about Magic is that it is this constantly evolving, as you just said with your analogy, right? It's a thing that is recognizable as one thing, but it's all kinds of different stuff kind of folded in. And there's this long history and trajectory, the history of playing cards. What did playing cards mean when they emerged in, Southern Europe in the 1400s?
Right.
What were the beliefs and cultures and ideas into that? And how does that, have this weird resonant impact on how Magic ends up shaping? And it does, I think. I think there's these weird resonances with art on cards and what art means and things. So anyway, there's chapters on things like the rules. Where did the rules come from? Who decided what they looked like? How did they change? What are the big rules revisions and why did they happen? There's a chapter on magic narrative over time. There's a chapter on actually the grammar of the card. What does it mean to look at what cards mean over time and how does that change? So it's just a bunch of different component pieces. My goal with the book is that anyone who has played Magic can pick it up and learn something interesting, contextualizing the game they enjoy. That's the hope. The hope is that this is not for random academics to have like a thing to cite. I that's great, but I don't care about that at all, right? The thing I really care about is if you enjoy Magic and you want to read a book about it, is there something here where you'll learn a little bit of stuff you didn't know and you'll, maybe discover some stuff about Magic that you didn't think about.
Right.
That's the goal. Yeah.
It is a little bizarre to consider that Richard Garfield effectively created this whole cloth out of nothing using the idea of baseball cards and being like, how do we play with baseball cards? And it's so weird to think of, like, before Magic, there was no notion of a collectible card game or even a collectible game that was expandable in this way. And it's wild. It's like, how do you, what leads to this crucible that comes up with this insanely long living game that, I mean, it's ridiculous, actually. It's very hard to fathom.
The thing that everyone gets hung up on in like the history of Magic, and it's an easy thing to get hung up on, is that, and then also I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but the Multnomah Falls experience where he's walking with his family, in this state park or national park, whatever, and he's just like, yeah, I guess you could have resources that were lands and they would be in the deck and you would pull them out and it's like, you just, you just walk around and thinking about it. And of course, Garfield, we know, and still continue, as far as I'm aware today, is just this voracious consumer of games, right?
Oh, yeah.
All of these pieces,
100%.
they're, microscopic pieces of Magic are everywhere, right? And then he is this kind of winnowing force that pulls it all together and then pushes it out. And I mean, that is the kind of magic of Magic in some ways, is that it is recognizable from 93 to now, precisely because at least the basic patterns of the game are the same, even though what it looks like is very, very different.
Exactly. I mean, like, even when you consider the basics of like the 5 colors, it's like even the symbolic nature of the colors are just inherent in Western society. Red and blue as oppositions, sure. Fire and ice, that's classic Western. Life and death from black and white, or green being the color of vibrancy versus like civilization. And it's just like, it's all stuff that when you think about makes sense, but to put it all together feels like one of those it's like the chemical soup of evolution, right? Like, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and stuff all existed. Putting them together into one cell that actually creates life is an entirely other thing, right? Like,
yeah. And so there's that thing. And then, the thing I'm really... The thing I've become much more interested in after having started the book and on working through the book, right, is that the very quick process that Wizards of the Coast, kind of got on in terms of defining all of that, all these things that you're talking about, of taking them from these bigger kind of general ideas to really pushing them very explicitly into, I don't know, these very legible and readable forms, right? And then everyone else tried to do it too, and it didn't really work out for any other game. And so I have this like sidebar project going on at the same time where I've bought a lot of other card games that came out, 94, 95, 96, 97.
Yeah, nobody remembers the SimCity card game.
Hey, I've got it's in my office at work, but I've got an unopened starter box of SimCity card game. Why? I've got that. I've been playing a lot of, is it On the Edge, which is the card game? Or Over the Edge?
On the Edge?
Let me tell you. Hold on. I can't. One's the RPG and one's the card game. On the Edge is the card game. So it's like a Magic competitor using that RPG system as its like lore base. I've been playing a lot of that. I'm very curious about those too. The Spellfire TSRs, like,
I have a full set of those somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I'm very close to a full set of Spellfire.
I'm a big Dragonlance guy, so obviously I had to collect the Dragonlance set. The thing is wild to me there was an article in either Inquest or in Scribe very early on that was a battle royale of CCGs where everybody was playing their pet CCG and they would go through and fight each other. And it was a absolutely hilarious article. And it ends with the Magic player versus SimCity guy. And the Magic dude goes, I crack my Ring of Maroof and I go grab my Armageddon because it turns out all of SimCity is lands.
It's lands. That's good. Yeah, the SimCity game is a beautiful. Have you ever played it before?
I played it in 1995 or something, so vaguely long time.
Yeah, it's so I've played it recently. You know, probably more recent than many other people on the planet. You know, in the past year or so.
Yeah,
and
I would guess that would probably be the only person.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I bought it from somebody, so you know, other people have these cards running around. But it is really weird because it is, you know, and I say this, you know, as politely as I can to the designers of SimCity. It's basically unplayable. Like it kind of just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. It's a completely bizarre game that
and there's a solo mode as well, which is really cool actually. So the idea is you play it and you build the city yourself. But
but SimCity should be a solo. I mean, if you release SimCity as a solitaire board game, that would be sick.
Yeah,
right? But as a competitive card game,
it didn't really. And they have the I forget what the card type is, but they have certain cards that are like double length. Right, that go into things. You could buy boosters that were double length boosters. I got a box of those.
It was a weird time, and people were just throwing things at the wall to see anything that would happen. We had like L5R, which was amazing. Yeah, we had the werewolf game. I played a lot of that. That was fun, but it was like every week. It felt like we would go to the store and there would be just another new. Somebody's like, "Wow, this seems to work. Let's see what happens." There was a hunger. There was a hunger for card games, and they fed it. But like, what the hell was I going to ask? Because one of the things, side note, randomly, is that you've done a lot of work with Darshana Jaimane, who is a person who I was like I've known for a while and also writes really, really well. And your articles on Civ are great.
Thanks.
A lifelong Civ junkie, and like because. One of the articles you wrote a long time ago that stuck with me was on humankind and how it was related to like Civ and just like placing it in that paradigm. And God, man, I cannot wait to see what Civ 7 does, because Civ 7 now being the base game, going back to all of these like Age of Empires and Humankind spinoffs and be like, oh, I guess we should do what they're doing. I'm like, no, don't do what they're doing. Stick to what you were doing. But
yeah, unfortunately, I can't talk about it. I mean, I've got 50 hours in Civ 7 right now, but I can't say much about it. But I think you were going to be at least interested in it when it comes out.
Dude, I've been playing I've played every Civ game since Civ. So I was actually planning on doing a spin-off podcast, like a short form series, just talking about Civilization, because I don't have like 1,000 episodes, but I probably got like 10.
Yeah, you should do it. That would be awesome. That's such a fascinating game franchise. You know, the way that it's changed too. But
that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down yet, because as of recording, I don't have Civ 7 yet, and so until I do, I'm going to hold on that. But let's talk about Magic more though. So like I know because like I've seen your articles in Kotaku, in like in Vice and other places. How like what are you? Let me think. Actually, what do I want to ask you here? Because like the question is, with Magic the Gathering, and you're not talking about strategy, you're not talking about like card value or evaluation or anything like that. When you're looking at Magic, what do you want to write about? Like, what speaks to you about this game?
Yeah, I mean, Magic, I think first thing to say maybe about that, answering that question is I really and truly believe Magic is the greatest game ever made. Just in terms of, I think that it is so capacious. It has been able to morph and change and adapt in so many ways. And it generates community around itself kind of organically, which is actually really shocking. Most games don't do that. Most games have to be, especially at this point, have to get kind of jump started or boosted, or they kind of jump off of another game, from one community kind of move to the other. And Magic still seems to be able to, based on its tie-ins or based on the way, Universes Beyond, all that stuff.
Right.
It seems to be able to kind of bootstrap better than a lot of other games, even though obviously it's borrowing from other fan cultures and things like that. So that's a thing that's pretty interesting to me. what I like about Magic, and the thing that I'm always digging for, is that there are so many people now, multiple generations of people at this point whose entire way of meaning making in the world is inextricable from Magic. Right, the way they talk about their world, the way they understand their world, is entirely understood through Magic. And I'm someone who's, I took basically a 2-year break in between maybe 2012 and 2014. I took a break from Magic. And I sold all of my fetch. I sold my fetch lands and Jason the Mind Sculptors and stuff like that. I had full play sets of, which
Sure.
I paid for my first year of graduate school with that, so it worked out.
Fair.
Right? You know what I mean? I had to make rent somehow, so it was okay. But once I figured my life out and got some other stuff going on, right? Once I started writing more online, I was
exactly.
I can buy Magic cards again. And so what's interesting to me, I think, about it is that Magic is this kind of microcosm. It's its own world. It's the bubble, right, that you were talking about before. But it's a bubble that's constantly defining itself in opposition with or in concert with other stuff around it. So Magic absorbs things, and Magic culture absorbs other things, and then kind of does its own remix on it and then pushes it back out in the world.
How do you mean?
I'm thinking about the way that I'm thinking about the way that fantasy and science fiction work there. Probably in my heart, I'm a Vorthos, right? I like playing Magic, and I can be very competitive when I want to be. I can kind of turn it on, and I'm never, I'm not a top 25% player, but I'm probably in the top half. I'm pretty good at the game. But there's something that's so fascinating to me about, you mentioned earlier Dragonlance, right? Those are the novels I grew up on. And then I got into Magic, and I got to see this very different kind of science fantasy thing. And then that, so Magic pulls that in and then does its own thing with it, right, through Urza's Saga and then Mirrodin and all this in Ravnica, right? These things that were immediately preceding when I started. And then Time Spiral, which is this fantasy, science fiction, nightmare apocalypse.
Post-apocalyptic chaos.
Right, yeah. So that gets put in. And then, now today I can recognize there's a whole generation of people who came up on that thing. That is so impactful on science fiction and fantasy literature and film of today, right? And so I think I see that, this is my bet, and this is something I work through in the book, but that's happening in a lot of places. It's particularly happening in game design and development.
Oh, yeah.
Where lots of people are, big Magic fans, and it's kind of pushed back out into the world, this whole perspective on genre and how it attaches to game mechanics. Caves of Cud, if people are not familiar with that game, kind of new roguelike that's out and doing really well. But Jason Greenblatt, who is one of the writers for that, kind of the, I think, head writer for it, huge Magic fan. We've talked about Magic a whole bunch of times, right? And you can, if you know that, you can look at that game and you can see it, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm really fascinated about that Magic is this kind of and Magic culture is this kind of self-stable engine that's pushing these things out into the world. And I think really being analytical about Magic and Magic's pieces, its component pieces, will help us, academically thinking, to face that audience. It helps us understand other parts of our culture that maybe we don't think of as related to Magic.
Right. Yeah, because you've seen this impact in board games. Dominion, for instance, creating the deck builder game because the dude was like, I like drafting and I just want to make a game that lets me draft all the time. Yeah. And drafting is, of course, the thing Magic innovated and created and came up with. And then this whole genre of Slay the Spire style games, or drafting type of, even with League of Legends or whatever, where you're you've got the auto battlers, and it's weird to think about because as somebody who existed before Magic did, and I can remember when it showed up, and I can remember switching from D&D to Magic because it's easier to carry, and I can play it in recess or whatever. And then there's people who are growing up who are literally Magic is the ecosystem of games that I've grown up in is Magic. And they don't know a before Magic. They don't know an after Magic because it hasn't ended yet. But it's just everything we look at comes to this framework. All of these other games have obviously it's weird because Magic hasn't really shot out designers to go and spew out into building more Magic the way Civ has. All these other games, Humankind was a former Civ head designer or whatever. But it's because a lot of Magic designers tend to go to League or Riot or whatever, and I guess you can see that kind of pedigree there, but it's not the same as showing up everywhere. But when you go to like GDC and you see people coming to Mark Rosewater's talk, and you're like, oh, everybody from every game genre ever has played Magic and knows Magic and wants to see the high designer Magic talk. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and you know that the Mark Rosewater GDC talk is still passed around in
it's so good.
Yeah, it gets passed around as like the gospel truth, right? About like making games, and that's also kind of interesting to me about Magic too, right?
He's written like multiple textbooks worth of articles of game design over 30 years.
I'm very aware. I essentially there is a chapter in the book that I'm not done with it yet. Actually, I'm still working on it, but it's essentially just about Mark Rosewater as a figure, right? Because there's no other person who has functioned in the way that Rosewater does for Magic for other games, which is like he's the Mr. Rogers of it. Well, but Sid Meier is Sid Meier, right?
Yeah.
Like, but Mark Rosewater is like the guy who speaks for Magic, right?
That's true. He is like the face and it's weird.
And you know the way the discourse around him works, which is like sometimes what he, you know, the thing that I think a lot about is like that the Tumblr, right, will get the Blogatog will get used as a lever by fans against the company, right? And it's like, all right, well, that's not a dynamic that's replicated anywhere else. Key developers' words are leveraged against the employer that he's representing, right? It's bizarre. So no, I've read easily 100,000 words of Mark Rosewater.
It's like using the word of the prophet against the church. Right? It's like, what?
Yes, yeah. And like, who speaks for the thing, right?
I've had many discussions with the PR teams at Wizards about sometimes Rosewater goes astray, and they're just like, oh God, please don't. What did he say now?
It's such an interesting dynamic. And again, it's unique. It's a thing that Magic does that no one else does, and it partially just has to do with history, right? Like Rosewater appeared at a very particular moment and came out of that, both of managing and operating the competitive events and also his role at the Duelist, and then that creates a very unique individual who also then starts working on design and then becomes a keystone of the company for a long time. And so that's a corporate history question. That's a kind of material history question that I think you really have to be kind of analytical and specific about to understand how it even works. And again, like I said, I don't think any other company, I've never heard of any other games company working in that way, right? It's bizarre.
It is complete. And there's this weird confluence of the fact that he loves talking about Magic. He's got that kind of like layer of hyper open communication of some of us ADHD types have, which is just like, oh, you've given me a channel to talk about my passion. This is my passion. You are going to hear about it. And being in his position, it's even hard to conceive of somebody who has directed a game for as long as he has.
Yeah.
Like even in the video game space, you'd have to go to like Square Enix to get somebody who has been like the head game director of a franchise for as long as Rosewater, or maybe like even in Nintendo, like maybe Zelda, but like, or Mario, but like, I mean, I don't know, like some of those guys have been promoted to management or whatever. Rosewater has very strictly resisted moving out of his spot, which is good and bad, both for Magic, because like, it's great. We have continuity. We have one guy, we've got the vision, but it also means that it's hard for new voices to come in or people to learn or promote themselves or grow, because Magic gets this weird cycle where they raise brand new designers, they teach them, they mold them, they shape them, and then those guys hit a wall because Rosewater's not moving, so there's nowhere up to go, so they go laterally to a different company and we lose all that brain space. But that being notwithstanding, the fact that this dude is so prolific and talks all the time about design and stuff, and if you look historically, because I periodically will go through and read the archives, and he'll talk about a thing, and then 15 years later, that thing will happen, and it'll be like, aha, told you. It's like, what the hell, man? What?
Yeah, I mean, he does have to. He seems to have an iron memory.
He's got.
It is kind of wild how consistent the narrative becomes, right? And I don't say narrative to like minimize it, but you know, he'll tell a story or make a prediction or whatever, and you can track it years later, and you're like, he has fully concretized this thing in his mind, right? One way or the other.
He's like, it's going to show up eventually, someday.
and we're talking about all of this. This is mostly just the written work. This has, we're not even talking about the, whatever 5 hours of podcast we get a week, which I've listened to also probably 150 hours of, and that's not even really scratching the surface, right?
Eventually I stopped once I realized a lot of his stories get repeated. Yes, and I'm like, okay, it's fair. Some people weren't even born when he started doing this show.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's the kind of thing where if you can go long enough, you can just start recycling because you have an incentive to do so. But he tells he tells a lot of the same stories, but that's interesting too, right? And it's I think that shows the most interesting when he's telling a story and then there's another person who was involved in it, who's on the show, who might have a different opinion, right? Or a different memory of it or whatever.
It is a little interesting to me because it also leads into this weird creator loop that I think about a lot, which is that you are so focused on creating, coming up with content every week. But if it's based on your life, you have to live your life to be able to continue to produce the content. But if your life has become just content generation, you don't have the time to actually do the parts that build up the backlog of stories you can tell. Because somebody mentioned to me the other day that, like, hey, Shivam, you tell the same story a lot on your podcast. And I'm like, that's because I'm talking to a new person every time and they haven't heard my stories. But my listeners have. Yeah. And so that means when I talk about how Reed Duke taught me how to draft or whatever for the 12th time, and I'm like, well, dude, how do I live a life of stories to tell you if I'm telling you the stories all the time? Anyway, sorry, that's a weird content up my own butt.
No, that's a real thing. Yeah, I've got 4 running podcasts or something like that, and I try to be as careful as possible. But one show has been going for 5 years or something. You get a repeat occasionally. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, look, dude, there's always a new listener who hasn't heard. Yeah. Some show is everybody's first show. That's actually one of the things I think I was talking to Rosewater about, which is that because I talked about, I'm like, how do you keep Magic fresh? How do you and one of the things he brings up as the biggest boon and issue of Magic is that every pack, every set is somebody's first pack, somebody's first set. And if it's and you sit there and you're like, can you imagine being the guy whose first Magic card was in Shadowmoor? Or you open it up and there's a million hybrid cards. You're like, what the hell do you want me to do with this? Or even freaking a War of the March of the Machine. Can you imagine your first pack being a March of the Machines collector's booster or something and be like, what the hell even is this? And I talked to him, I'm like, how do you manage to maintain a 30-year long fandom of people who are dedicated to giving you billions of dollars and playing your game all the time, with the fact that you need to continually acquire new users who don't know what the hell any of this stuff is?
Yeah.
I mean, until Foundations came out, I don't think they had a good answer. And I think it would be really interesting to, you should write an article about that.
It's in the book. I mean, I can tell you that there's going to be some stuff about that in the book. Since I started working on it, really seriously, I'd been making little pieces of it for, maybe a year before I made it my only project I was working on. There's a reason why I haven't written all that much in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
Yeah, it's just, kind of tapered off because I got other stuff going on. But but yeah, during the time I've really seriously been working on it is I've gone to more pre-releases than I ever had. I was not an ever pre-release kind of person, but I would go to 1 or 2 a year. And now I've gone to, I think, all of them since I've been working on the book. And I'm in I'm in a regional city, right? I'm not in a big metro area. We don't have very many game stores, things like that. And so I go to those places and I see people who are, maybe they're not opening their first pack, but they're opening their first 25 for sure. Right. In the thing. And, they're, alongside of that, there are people who seem like and feel like they're very comfortable with the game, who are part of that crowd, who maybe have a dozen full complete games under their belt. But I had an experience the other day, and this will be in the book, but where a fairly new player just did not believe me about how combat damage worked. just did not believe me that the two things hit each other at the same time. Right. My 2/2 kills your 2/2. Right. Yeah. Just would not. I couldn't. And made this kind of imposition on me that I was angle shooting to at the thing. And I was like, look, bud, I'm not trying to get one over on you at all. We can ask anyone in this room of 60 people if you would, if you want to know. but this is how it works. And that's also the player, right? That pack and that design has to speak to, right? Is the person who feels like they get it but don't.
Let me tell you a story. I was at MagicCon Philadelphia, and there was Gavin was doing the first mystery event there that he did, where he's got like chaos boosters and then also these handful of weirdo cards or something. And I sat down to play, and one of the dudes I was playing against, it was literally his first time play. It's like maybe his second time playing Magic ever. And I was like, and he had played maybe like 15, 30 years ago or something, and he'd forgotten, but his friend was like, hey, MagicCon's in town, we should go.
Yeah.
And he's sitting, I'm like, you're telling me your introduction to Magic is this most invested possible section of the game, playing like Gavin's mystery draft, where you're like, I don't know how combat works, but like, and I'm like, oh, my dear friend. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
And that's an interesting thing. And that also doesn't tend to be the way that most other games work, right?
No.
It's like, you don't really play League of Legends by being like, all right, so we're in the Platinum League now.
Evo.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So we're going to go to my local here. And
I mean, maybe if your local's got Daigo or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's such an interesting and weird thing. Magic is really invitational. It asks you to come and engage with it.
So do you know Olivia Gobert-Hicks?
Yes.
Of her?
Yeah.
She's on the rules committee now, and she's like a cosplayer and famous. And her intro to Magic is still one of the most bizarre and baffling things I've ever seen in my life. She learned to play with two-headed giant commander. Oof. So 8 people, a pair each, with 2 decks each, playing free-for-all commander game. I'm like, that's how you learned? How do you get into literally playing just Calvin Ball with Commander back when Commander was still insanely hard, and you're playing with 8 people? What the hell is going on? Yeah. How did you stick with this? How did you not just say like, yo, dude, this is not for me? Because I remember later she's like, yeah, I need to learn how to actually draft and play standard for like this video I'm doing, and I have no idea how to not play Commander. And I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah, it seems like I didn't do that, right? So it's like really is interesting to hear about that kind of thing, because you hear about that a lot now, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people's on ramp to the game is Commander or something like it.
Yeah, but not quite that insane. Like, Kat Bailey came to who was on my show recently, and also once an editor at IGN and stuff. She came to my house and to one of my birthday parties, and we were hanging out, and she's like, oh, she showed me how to play Magic, and we were playing Commanders. I'm like, well, here's a pre-constructed deck, the mono green from C14 or whatever. It's pretty self-explanatory. You're a gamer, you should be able to figure it out, and I'll help you if you didn't know. And so once we taught her like the basics of like resource management or whatever, her gamer instincts came in and she won, but it was still like wild to because I was just sitting there, I'm like, dude, none of these cards have any shared vocabulary. Right. Every keyword is different. Every rules interaction is a weird niche rule. There's a theme vaguely, but it's not like a cohesive one. And I was just sitting there like, this is surely not what Richard Garfield intended when he was teaching us.
I mean, I've clarified this before. This is in an interview I did with Richard Garfield like a few years ago.
You got to talk to him. I'm so jealous.
Yeah. So I interviewed him for Vice maybe for the 25th anniversary or 20th. I don't know, a while back. And and I asked him because that was when
the 25th anniversary.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
I have the article up.
Okay. Good. Yeah. So at the very end, I was like, listen, there's a thing people say about Magic as Richard Garfield intended. When things go really weird. What do you think about that? And he was like, yes. He's like, if the game is being kind of played maximally to its, with all these interactions or whatever, it is what I intended. So yes, that is what Richard Garfield intended. And there's no greater accomplishment in my life than to find out that whatever wild thing you're doing in Magic that you think is absolutely absurd, it is confirmed by Richard Garfield that it is what he intended. So
let me read that section because I think it's really actually funny.
Yeah, please do, because it's been a while, obviously, since I looked at it.
There's a meme in Magic now where when you do something truly absurd, you just say, just as Richard Garfield intended. How do you feel about that? And then Richard replies, I've never heard that. I was like, what? There's no way you haven't. But he's like, I've never heard that. And it exactly calls back to earlier in this interview where I said that I celebrated when people did things I didn't expect. It's certainly not what I expected or intended, which is the point. But on the other hand, it is exactly what I intended in that I wanted it to extend into places in which I didn't intend. And I'm like, that is such a Garfieldian answer.
Yeah,
right
that
there.
guy rules.
Of just
That's so
very
good.
circular logic of just like, yes, my intention is for you to create a game state that has never been created before and that I have never seen and never experienced, and nobody will ever, because just the combinatrix of this game are so chaotic. And I think that's like, for instance, why I love Commander so much is because every game of Commander you sit down to, as not counting CDH because that's a different bowl of fish, but like every game of Commander you sit down to, and you're playing with 4 decks, of which these 4 combination may never have happened in history, and people put out cards and they're 100 card singleton, so you don't know what the order is. Random cards are going to come out, and their card and your card are going to interact in a way that's. There's a story I tell a lot that I'm going to tell you right now because I think it's really fascinating. I was playing a game with Sheldon Menery, and we were playing with 2 people from the Play EDH Discord server. And it was during lockdown when we were all playing over Spell Table. And so player A, player 2 had a Foretold card, a face down Foretold card. Player A cast Wrath of God. And so the Wrath of God goes, and player B goes and flips over his card, and he's like, it's this Foretold card from Call Time Commander, which phases out all of your creatures. And it says, all my creatures phase out until the end of turn, and then they come back. And so he's like, aha, I'm saving my board. I'm going to beat all of you. My board gets wiped, and then it turn goes to Sheldon. Sheldon sits there and looks for a second, and he plays Reigns of Power. Reigns of Power is a card that like costs 7 mana or something that says, exchange all of my creatures with target other players' creatures. So this dude has phased out, and it's on the stack, and Richard and Sheldon's like, all right, well, I'm going to Reigns of Power. We're going to swap boards. My creatures are going to get phased out. Your creatures are going to sit here and get Wrath, phase and come back. I get my creatures back. GG's. And I'm like, oh my God, that is the coolest play I've ever seen in my life. Featuring a card from this year of that year, like 22 or 21 or whatever, and a card from freaking 1997 doing something that had never in God's earth been intended, but this rules. Yeah. And it was the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I think that's what gives Magic a lot of its legs, is that we can take these cards from different slices of the universe and put them together and get something cohesive that works with itself, which is weird. Like, I can't take a creature from Street Fighter 2 and a creature from Street Fighter 7 and put them on the same fighting field. Well, you can in that one weird Street Fighter CPS 2 game that let you pick, but that's not the point. The point is, they're okay. Maybe Street Fighter's the wrong angle because they could work.
It could work.
They could work. Yeah. But it's also like, I can't take Super Mario Brothers 1 and Super Mario Odyssey and have those 2 characters meet up and play with each other. Yeah. That would be weird.
But Magic, that's desired, right?
Yeah, Magic, that's
and if you can figure
out
how to do that, right, you've just created like a new vintage deck, which congratulations, right? Like,
I think it's awesome.
Yeah. I think about that a lot with the Thassa's Oracle Doomsday stuff, right? Which is just like these beautiful, like 2 beautiful moments in time that have been connected by this, like, you know, lattice work of rules, right?
I don't know anyone's ever called Doomsday and Thassa's Oracle a beautiful moment.
I think it's beautiful. I love it. This is where, like, you know, the part of writing a book like this and doing work like this is like, some of it comes from you, you know, or in my, you know, interests or whatever, right? And then some of it comes from like recognizing, you know, who I am and what my interests are, because in kind of bracketing those away, right? Because like, I gotta be honest with you, not a big Commander player. Don't enjoy Commander at all. Not really. Despite the fact that I like casual Magic a lot. I like kitchen table Magic, 60 card kitchen table a whole lot. And
I love
like a bunch of those. Yeah, but really not a Commander person.
You don't like multiplayer?
It's not even the multiplayer part. It's that gummed up board state kind of stuff, right? And the kind of focus on having to clear the way, the dynamic you were talking about before.
Sure.
I'm not mad when I play Commander, but it's just not the thing I step out for. But I do like Doomsday, right? And
Doomsday piles are great, man. Like there is an artistry for building a perfect 5-card pile that'll win you the game.
Yeah, and I big fan of Cube, really big fan of these bizarre rules interactions that produce just really interesting things and things that are predictable. That's really great to me too. Is like Doomsday is a good example of an extremely weird set of things that when they go together produce something that you wouldn't have thought from any of these positions you could have gotten to. And I really like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think of sometimes like some of these decks that people come up with that are just the most interesting and surreal, weird ways to win that you were sure would like the eggs deck, for instance, or like lantern control. And you're like, this is surely this is not what you intended. Like the most miserable induced pile of crap. But then it just there's a beauty to just watching the like people find things in Magic every day that are just so bizarre, so elegant.
Yeah.
And I remember I was talking to a pro tour player who's on the like who plays in like, you know, these big tournaments and worlds and stuff. I'm like, how do you even come up with something like that weird vampire deck? Like, who was thinking about Sorin ever when a card? Well, he's like, well, it puts things out for free. And I was like, oh, maybe there's cards I can put out for free. I'm like, how do you remember that? There's like 10,000 cards.
Yeah.
And just the fact that the way I play and the way you play and the way Luis Scott Vargas or Kai or whatever plays are fundamentally different games, but they're all under this umbrella of of Magic. And it's just like building a game that lasts for a long time is one thing. Building a game engine that lasts for a long time is an entirely other thing. Yeah. And there's this just like, I mean, I guess Garfield gets credit all day long, but I don't think he gets enough for building maybe one of the most impressive, backwards compatible, fully modular, optimized boxes of games you could ever do.
Well, and the playtesters at Penn too, right? Like those initial people who just like put a lot of pressure on the thing to see what it could hold, and the fact that it did hold, right, which is impressive. I mean, the thing to around what you said here too is that, you know, when I started working on the book, I immediately confronted this issue, right? Which is like, it's a bunch of different stuff, but it's all one thing. So what do you do? And so I ended up going to the kind of history of management, which was really interesting. So the idea of these like massive corporations, right? From the end of the 19th century forward, of how did they manage all of these different things that ultimately were meant to produce this big whole? And so that'll be a big chunk of the book, or not a big chunk, but part of the theoretical apparatus of the book is, you know, how did the 1950s corporation imagine all these different weird component parts and make them talk to one another, right? And kind of do that. And it's very interesting to see how some of that historical stuff worked, and then think about it kind of isomorphically, right, in relationship to this to Magic design. And it kind of is the same way of like, you know, the different planes and the different mechanics that show up in those different places, they are radically different. But you know, they have the engine as you're talking about, but they also have all this other, you know, resonance with one another that, you know, half of the cards in the game are just some form of kicker, for example, right? You know, and that subsystem, you know, making it speak to the rest of everything and resonate is really interesting. I think a lot of my interest in the game, we were talking about, you know, kind of decks or whatever. I think a lot of my interest in the game comes from the fact that I entered during Time Spiral and started paying attention really quickly to competitive play. Similar to you were talking about reading in college, right? Like, during high school, I was just on the computer in the computer lab every day. I was supposed to be taking like online AP classes, and I just read the mothership every day. And being like, pickles? What is pickles?
Oh God,
like, what? Deck. Yeah, and that was like one of the first competitive decks I paid attention to. I was like, oh, you can do this. And like, I remember going to F&M in this like little terrible store, not terrible store, just a small store, and like was not Magic focused. That I went to in high school, and it was a half-hour drive, you know, both ways. So it's, you know, it's a commitment to go to F&M, and going with my like deck I made out of a starter deck and, you know, a couple like Ravnica packs I bought from Walmart. So like, just, you know, this terrible kitchen table-y kind of deck, probably didn't even have 75 cards, probably just like, you know, a blunt 60.
All the cards I own.
Yeah, it's all the cards I own, you know, no sleeves, any of that. And showing up and just getting destroyed by Dragonstorm, like an 11-year-old playing Dragonstorm, just annihilating me, and then me being like, "Oh my God, you could do that! You could summon 5 Begarden Hellkites all at one time."
Oh no! Why do you have 5 in your deck?
yeah. I was like, wow. And so I think that was a big part too. And I remember too, there being a guy there at the same shop who played Glare of Subdual, and I was like, you could just tap down all my creatures. All I have are creatures. What are you talking about? That's all I have. So my entryway into the game was at a very complex, you know, perhaps a too complex period through some decks that, are just deeply unfair and weird, but I really found that exciting,
Yeah,
there's a world in
absolutely.
which I didn't, and we're not having this conversation today, but I think that's what really sticks out to me still about the game.
Yeah. Like, I mean, it's weird because, like, for me, I started playing in 1994. Magic was introduced in 1993. So, like, when I started, we were still in the, oh my God, I've got like fireballs and I've got snakes that can swim and all these things. It's like we were still caught up in the majesty of the novelty of it all, and not in like, because I remember when I came back from my lengthy gap, my friend took me to go drafting, and we drafted Rise of the Eldrazi, which because I'd been playing Duels of Planeswalkers on Xbox, it brought me back to the game and in a real like tangible way. And so he's like, "Oh, you've been playing Magic? Let's go draft." And I'm like, "I've never drafted before because it didn't exist when I left." And so when I came back, and I'm like, "I know theoretically how to draft because I've read articles and I've watched tournaments and stuff." And I'm like, I crack it open. The first card I get on my pack is a freaking Sarkhan the Mad, which is a planeswalker that goes down only.
Yeah.
And A, I've never seen a planeswalker before. B, this guy's got no up. C, I was like, okay, well, it must be like a creature. It's got summoning sickness, right? I play it, it gets killed immediately because like the dude just attacks into it. And I was like, you mean I could have just used that? What the hell is going on? And also, like, not having drafted Rise of the Eldrazi is one of the hardest sets in the world.
That has to be.
It was just like, what am I doing?
There's essentially 2 decks for you to draft. Good luck. Pick one of those.
Like walls are big. And it's like, what is going on? But yeah, it's just, I don't know. There's something about just like, for me, it doesn't matter what format I'm playing. If my deck can tell a story, an emergent story can come out through my play, then I'm a happy camper. Yeah. And that's, I think, the thing that, like, I look, especially in 24, Magic had Bloomburrow and Duskmourn back to back, and like bookended, like Modern Horizons 3, Bloomburrow, Duskmourn. If you can have those 3 fully disparate ideas in 1 year that will all play together in a fusion, in a cohesive manner, that if you just care about the bottom of the cards, you can make it all work out, is nuts to me.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I mean, I don't know. I think it shows a lot of the core strength of what makes this game so good.
Yeah, I agree.
It's wild. I don't know. And I think, like, for instance, like you were mentioning, we were talking earlier about Assassin's Creed and the UB stuff. I think the Universes Beyond, I was skeptical at first because I don't care about Stranger Things or whatever the hell the other one was, The Walking Dead.
The Walking Dead, yeah.
But when I saw the Street Fighter cards, as a lifelong Street Fighter guy, I was like, oh, I get it. Oh, you have Ryu do Hadouken by untapping to do the motions, and I'm like, this is the greatest design I've ever seen in my life. Chun-Li with multi-kicker, are you kidding me? It's so good. And that's when I realized, Magic is the perfect game because you could literally do anything you want in there. And so it's gonna be real wild to see what Final Fantasy or Spider-Man look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a almost like beyond the game just beauty to some of that stuff where because the mechanics are like representational a lot of the time, right? The even Elvish Archdruid, right? The tapping, you exhaust yourself in order to like commune with all the other elves to like produce this mana, right? Like the storytelling of just like what happens when you tap something, what happens when you an attack trigger happens, any of that stuff.
Right.
It's just really powerful, even if you think about it for just a second. And I do kind of wonder once we start getting the kind of mass Universes Beyond stuff like Final Fantasy or like Spider-Man, we've talked a bunch of times already about novelty, right? They're like, there's novelty in Magic when it shows up. And I do wonder if the novelty of the matching mechanic to the thing I care about is going to kind of wear off, which would be really disappointing.
I thought about that too with like Lord of the Rings, for instance, or Fallout. But then what I realized is that the audience of people who care about this slice of thing versus the grand scheme of Magic, it's like each slice has a dedicated fan base that loves that thing.
Yeah.
Like insanely loves, like, for instance, Doctor Who came and kind of thudded, right? Like nobody cared about it. It was like vaguely, but the people who care absolutely lost their minds. And I think that's going to happen with all these UB products. It's like most people will be indifferent to, okay, whatever. And then the people who are like the diehards are going to be like, I cannot believe you got Ramza Beowulf on the dot. Perfect, right? Like for instance, I knew like Assassin's Creed fans who were looking at the cards going like, whoa, I can't believe they got this weird thing that I don't remember happening because I only remember the first 2 games. I remember coming back from my honeymoon in Rome, and Assassin's Creed 2 had just come out. And I was like, holy crap, we can retrace our steps through northern Italy. There was a sandwich shop right here. You know, it was amazing. It ruled, dude. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. And I think the next 2-3 years are going to really show us how strong the brand is versus user fatigue. Because if like the rumored Avatar: The Last Airbender thing comes out, is that going to be like a big deal, or is it going to be just like, what are we? Especially now that it's all standard legal, the fact that Final Fantasy is going to be in standard with Bloombro is kind of wild. Like, what the hell is that going to be?
Yeah, I have a lot of big question marks about that, and I think in some ways I'm very thankful. Like the book kind of stops before that point. You know, I don't know exactly what year the book stops, but it's before right now. You know, I can say that. Probably the last thing that'll be in the book is MagicCon Vegas. I went to MagicCon Vegas, and I did a bunch of interviews with designers for the game, with the intent of producing like an article for Paste, and it just like didn't cohere for whatever reason. There was some scheduling stuff, but I think over the next like maybe month or two, I'll be doing a big article of like, what is it like to play Magic in at the beginning of 2025. So I think that stuff will end up coming out in some form. But yeah, that was really interesting to me about being there, because that's where a lot of that was announced. And there was a really interesting, I would say, tenor change around some of that for just players I was listening to talk about it. Some people were really excited and some people were very negative about it. And that, I don't know. I've been at several events where things were announced and there was a level of negativity I was hearing that was a little more negative than some other stuff that I'd heard, for previous announcements.
I could tell you all about negativity in announcements sometime. Ask me about Commander. But in any case, though, I'm gonna leave that one alone.
Yeah, sure.
This has been a lovely chat. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to see your book, or at least see where what conclusions you draw. Because like, I don't know. I think this game is fascinating. I think it's ripe for writing about, and I'm glad that somebody who's got the chops is doing it. So thank you so much once again.
Yeah, thank you. And the book will be out, I don't know, sometime in the next like 2 years.
Yeah, you're still working on it, so
there'll be all kinds of stuff coming before that. Are
you going to release excerpts?
Well, probably not excerpts, but there will definitely be the other project I've mentioned of like the also ran games. I'll have some stuff coming out on that, which I think people who like Magic will probably at least like the historical interest for.
Nice.
And so, you can follow me on Blue Sky. I'm just my name on Blue Sky, so
cool.
Easy to follow.
Awesome. And with that, my friends, as always, you can find me at Gearporty Gears on Twitter or at Shivam Bhatt on Blue Sky. Really, I use Blue Sky more than Twitter now, and I think Twitter has basically gone just to advertising when I put up new shows or whatever, because it's not a fun place to be anymore. But you can find the show anywhere podcasts are sold or at YouTube every Tuesday, thanks to my editor, Dan. You also hear me on Shivam and Wheeler Love Magic or on the Chronicles of Dragonlance podcast, where I talk about other things related to things I like. But with that, my friends, it's not magic without the gathering, and we'll see you next time.